For my citizen video, I decided to talk about some of the worst environmental disasters caused by humans. I thought it'd be interesting to look into some of the biggest environmental disasters that have happened in the past 100 years. It's important to understand the effect pollution has on our environment in order to prevent it. I find environmental disasters really interesting to learn about, even though they are really sad. It's crazy to see all that has been affected due to the specific cases of pollution throughout the world, and a lot of them are unbelievable. The 4 environmental disasters I'll be talking about were the 4 that stood out to me the most, in terms of my general interest in their environmental impact. I hope to share interesting and useful information on these 4 disasters, as well as show the environmental and societal impact as a whole. The first environmental disaster I wanted to talk about was the British petroleum oil spill. It's important to talk about it because it was the biggest oil spill in United States history, and it happened in my lifetime. Just for those 2 reasons, I think it's relevant information for everyone to be aware of and understand. The Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded and sank on April 20th, 2010. This explosion resulted in the death of 11 BP employees and left the well uncapped for 87 days. The disaster took place in the Gulf of Mexico, about 42 miles off the coast of Louisiana. The uncapped pipe within those 87 days was estimated to have leaked over 3.19 million barrels, which equals about 130 million gallons of oil into the Gulf. The disaster was mainly caused by BP, and they take responsibility for it along with 2 of their contractors. Tony Hayward, BP's chief executive, said, "It is evident that a series of complex events rather than a single mistake or failure led to the tragedy. Multiple parties, including BP, Halliburton, and Transocean, were involved. BP was forced to pay $20.8 billion in reparations in April of 2016, making it the largest environmental settlement ever. It was a series of 8 key mistakes that directly led to the explosion and disaster. A valve failure caused by a bad cement seal allowed the oil to travel to the surface. The BP crew could have fixed the issue here, but they misinterpreted the results of the pressure tests conducted. The gas and mud from the pipe came aboard the rig and was diverted to a gas-oil separator that normally works with smaller amounts and failed due to high volume. With gas on board, there is a detector specifically designed to shut vents leading to the engine room, a source to ignite the gas. This system failed as well, which led to the inevitable explosion that resulted. The whole ecosystem that exists in these waters was permanently altered. The wildlife was immediately significantly damaged. And since the spill happened very recently, just in 2010, it is hard to tell what the long-term effects may be. Dolphin death count per year increased significantly following the spill, starting from 60 deaths per year before the spill and after averaging about 200 deaths per year. It has since declined. Coral has also shown significant damage as the oil makes it harder for coral larvae to bind to hard surfaces. Some fish and shrimp were reported to have lesions and deformities, but the populations have seemed to recover and are now safe to eat as well. The overall effect of the crisis resulted in 11 deaths and significant damage to the ecosystem permanently. To try and relieve the damage caused by the spill, scientists use floating booms to contain surface oil and chemical oil dispersants to break it down underwater. These dispersants are chemicals that break down oil into smaller particles that mix with water more easily. These prevent oil slicks on the surface of water. It's important to realize the impact of reckless oil extracting and what it can do to an ecosystem. Today, it is hard to tell what the long-term damage may be from the BP oil spill, but it is easy to see the short-term. Populations are slowly recovering from the disaster, but what impact we might see in the future is to be determined. The second environmental disaster I wanted to talk about happened a little further back, but still in very recent history. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant had a severe accident in April of 1986. The disaster took place in Chernobyl, Ukraine, and was the result of a power surge during a reactor system test when anti-surge systems were purposely down for the tests. The high-power reactors are called RBMKs, and they use graphite in a chain reaction with water to cool the core. The surge was not expected and resulted in a highly dangerous explosion and fire that released radioactive chemicals into the air. The explosion itself only ended up killing 2 people within 2 hours. The radiation following the explosion, however, killed 28 of the 600 nuclear power plant employees within 4 months of the accident. An additional 106 employees of these 600 got radiation sickness from the high levels of exposure. Of the 200,000 people who were part of the cleanup, REM levels of 1 to 100 were documented for employees. For reference, the average U.S. citizen receives 0.6 REM per year. The millions of people in nearby areas surrounding the plant were of major concern, but before heavy exposure, 115,000 people were evacuated in highly contaminated areas, and followed by 220,000 more. Because of a successful evacuation following the disaster, the health effects on the surrounding population were neutral. Their REM levels are around 0.1 per year, which is less than the average for a U.S. citizen to receive. The unit that exploded was giving off lots of radiation, so emergency crews, helicopters covered the plant in a combination of sand and boron to stop the fire and prevent further nuclear reactions. The radioactive debris covered up would be referred to as the sarcophagus. The sarcophagus itself was still giving off radiation, which triggered the building of the new confinement. The sarcophagus was to be completely covered in the new confinement and would last up to 100 years. The new confinement would process and store spent fuel assemblies from the undamaged units 1, 2, and 3 in dry, double-walled canisters, actually making it useful. Chernobyl wasn't as deadly of a disaster compared to some of the other disasters I've covered, but its impact was huge. It developed the first skepticisms regarding nuclear power plants and resulted in a complete abandonment of a city. Although surrounding cities were evacuated before the worst of the radiation, many of the people were still heavily affected and harmed by this disaster. This horrible, human-generated disaster took place in Vietnam during the Vietnam War against the United States. The disaster was caused purposefully by the United States government, and since the United States and Vietnam were at war, the U.S. wanted to take preemptive actions. Their intention was to destroy the forest cover and crucial food crops used by Vietnam soldiers. To execute this idea, the forests and crops of Vietnam were sprayed with a strong blend of herbicides called Agent Orange. About 20 million gallons of Agent Orange was sprayed over the course of 10 years, from 1961 to 1971. The intended target was the northern Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops, but the non-combatant southern Vietnam was also affected. Agent Orange was given its name because of the distinctive orange labels on the 55-gallon containers that are used for shipping and storing. Agent Orange wasn't the only mix of herbicides used either. Agent Pink, Green, Purple, White, and Blue were other mixtures included on the list of chemicals used. However, Agent Orange made up the majority of herbicides sprayed in Vietnam, comprising of over 13 million gallons of the 20 million sprayed total. The key chemical in the herbicidal blend affecting people was dioxin apart from the herbicides themselves. Dioxin is a chemical which is a byproduct of the manufacturing processes for these herbicides. Studies done on laboratory animals have proven that dioxin is highly toxic even in minute doses. Dioxin is a widely known carcinogen, but it also affects the skin and can lead to diseases like diabetes, type 2, and other system dysfunctions. Over 400,000 Vietnamese citizens were killed or maimed as a direct result of Agent Orange. More than 500,000 children were born with birth defects, as well as an additional 2 million people were reportedly suffering from cancer or other diseases. Not to mention, United States soldiers in Vietnam during wartime were also harmed by Agent Orange. United States veterans were given wartime settlements after President George H.W. Bush signed the Agent Orange Act in 1991. The settlement supported those affected by Agent Orange during the time of the war, as long as you were from the United States. Those affected in Vietnam, however, received nothing. A class action lawsuit was brought up by a group of Vietnamese citizens affected by Agent Orange chemicals. They intended to sue the same companies that have given payouts to the U.S. veterans. The case, however, was dismissed, causing major Vietnamese and U.S. veteran outrage. The case was dismissed because the United States would have to admit to committing war crimes. Admitting to war crimes would cause countless lawsuits to be brought up, which would be followed by billions of dollars worth of lawsuits. It is so sad to see such a negative case of an environmental disaster, especially one intentionally caused to hurt a large amount of people and one caused by the United States. The people of Vietnam have not received justice, and it is hard to say if they ever will. The environmental and societal damage caused by Agent Orange should never be repeated or reconsidered as a practice because it is nothing but damaging to everyone and everything it touches. The next disaster happened even further back than Vietnam. I wanted to talk about a disaster that was caused by people unintentionally who suffered the direct consequences of their actions. Unfortunately, this disaster is a sad occurrence, but also an important one to take note of. The the London smog disaster wasn't caused by anyone specifically, rather it was caused by a city full of people in a strange week of foggy weather. The Great Smog of 1952 took place in London. When the city experienced a harsh, cold 2 weeks of weather, they fueled their fireplaces with coal. The same year, the main system of transportation in London was switched from the electric tram to diesel-fueled buses. London's factory smokestacks also contributed to the heavy smoke in the city. It was only a few hours until the smoke reached dangerous levels as it started to sit in the city. The weather system kept hot air above the clouds and trapped in the cool, smoky air underneath, preventing it from dissipating. London is already foggy and was so smoky after a few hours that public transportation was shut down and visibility was severely limited. The fog combined with the smoke to make smog. History.com says that the smog was so dense that the residents in some sections of the city were unable to see their feet as they walked. The ground was also covered in a greasy, slick texture from all the smoke. The people of London would return home with faces and nostrils full of black soot. The Great Fog was more than just a cloud of smoke covering visibility. It was dangerous. The elderly, children, and those with respiratory issues were severely at risk. It was first estimated that about 4,000 people died because of the smog. It has more recently been stated by experts that the actual death toll ranges from at least 8,000 deaths and up to 12,000. The smog sat for 5 days until it was finally blown away onto the North Sea. This environmental disaster is important to talk about because of the sheer impact it had on the health of people. Just in 5 days of heavy smoke, 4,000 people died. The issues and complications from those 5 days would last a lifetime. It's important to think about long-term effects when talking about pollution, because just a day's worth of an environmental disaster can last for generations to come. In all that I've learned from the various disasters, I think it is important to take preemptive measures to prevent these issues from happening again. These preemptive measures start with education about what has caused them in the past. Learning from the past can also be in the form of new laws to make sure the same event cannot happen again. There are many horrible cases of pollution all around the world today, and it's important to realize what's going on. I thought it'd be useful to gather background information on huge cases of pollution just to see the overall impact. I hope the environmental disasters covered in this video were of interest to the listener and will cause reflection upon reading. Thanks for listening.